Peter Dickinson, editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert blog, who joins us from Kyiv Live. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. What is your assessment of what is going on in Bakhmut? Let's start with that at the moment.
Good evening. It seems that in Bakhmut we are finally seeing a Ukrainian pushback, but it's not in the city itself of Bakhmut. It's on the flanks to the north and south of the city. So the impression at the moment is that Ukraine is actually trying to encircle the Russian troops who have for some months been advancing very, very slowly but steadily within the city itself. What we've seen in the last few days is relatively small but quite significant advances by the Ukrainian forces on the flanks, and reports which have been confirmed by the Russian side of Russian troops basically fleeing from the flanks, indicating that they may actually be a lot weaker than had been previously assumed.
What do you think the prospects are of a significant breakthrough in this counter-offensive that has been sort of long coming from the Ukrainian side over the course of this spring and early summer?
Well, I don't think what we're seeing in Bakhmut in recent days is actually a signal that the counter-offensive has begun.
Right.
This is a localised affair. The counter-offensive writ large has yet to begin, I believe, and what we will more likely see there, Bakhmut is in the east of Ukraine. It's far more likely that the main weight of the counter-offensive will actually be in the south, and the strategic goal will be to separate, to basically break through the Russian front and to separate the Russian forces and isolate the Russian forces who are in the south of Ukraine today. Essentially to cut them off and to establish a very large encirclement. Now, in order to do that, Ukraine will have to overcome Russian defences which have been prepared for the past 6 months. So it's not an easy task by any means, but much will depend on the ability of the Russian troops to stand and the morale of those troops. And there are big question marks over whether those Russian troops actually have the stomach for a fight at this stage.
Indeed, because we've seen some conflict, haven't we, between Moscow and the head of the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group being this group of paramilitary group, mercenaries in effect, that the Russians have become quite reliant on. And the head of the Wagner Group saying that at least some Russians were abandoning their posts in Bakhmut.
Yes, exactly. The Russian invasion has been sort of plagued by these divisions within their forces. There have essentially been a number of different interest groups, I suppose you could call them, within the Russian forces in Ukraine. There are the Russian regular troops, the Russian professional army. There is the mobilized element of basically conscripted troops. Then you have the Wagner troops. You have the Chechen forces. And you have the conscripted forces from within Ukraine who have been press ganged into serving it. So you have perhaps 4 or 5 different interest groups who are often competing against each other. And certainly in recent days, we've seen a lot of very vocal complaints from the leadership of Wagner complaining about Russian troops retreating, Russian troops abandoning their positions, and the hierarchy, the leadership in Moscow, the Ministry of Defense essentially, not providing the weapons that they need to fight.
And in terms of Russia's ability to continue to prosecute this war, Peter, I mean, where do you assess that as being at the moment? Obviously, they've had this first mobilisation they've had. Do you think Putin's going to have to mobilise again? And what is their ability to continue to sustain the war effort, given the sort of problems they've had over resources, ammunition and so on?
I think it's looking more and more likely that they will need to do a new mobilisation. They mobilised around 300,000 troops in September of last year. It was the first mobilisation in Russia since World War II. So it was a fairly big step that Putin had reportedly been very, very reluctant to take, but ultimately was obliged to take because of the losses they'd suffered in Ukraine. He's now facing a decision where he has to take even more dramatic steps in terms of another mobilization. The argument has always been that Russia is essentially using less politically sensitive troops in Ukraine, less politically sensitive conscripts. They've been drawing their troops from the regions of Russia, the poorest regions, or the ethnic minority regions in Siberia, in the Caucasus area, areas which are less sensitive for the Russian government, at some point, if they have another mobilization, they will have to begin drawing troops from the heartlands, from St. Petersburg and Moscow, which will be very politically sensitive for Russia and very, very huge risk for the Putin regime. So there'll be resistance to doing that. But the way things are moving at the moment, it looks like they will have to do so within the next few months, perhaps.
And Peter, in terms of looking to what the resolution, the conclusion of this war might look like, is your sense that we are really any closer towards that, or any closer to sort of the outlines of what any sort of deal could be? Because, of course, the Ukrainian government's position and the Russian government's position continues to be polar opposite, right? I mean, the Ukrainian government position is that not only must all territory be restored, but that would include not only the status quo ante compared to 2022, but back to 2014, includes Crimea.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a huge gap between the two positions, and there's no real middle ground on which to negotiate. Ukraine's position is based, unless they liberate all the territory of their country, unless they re-establish their sovereignty, there can be no realistic peace. It will simply be at best a pause. We'll simply see a pause, and then we'll have a new stage in this long-running war. Ukrainians see the war that we have today as part of a very long historic process of Russia attempting to dominate and essentially extinguish Ukrainian statehood. So from a Ukrainian point of view, there's really very little room to negotiate. The Russians, I think, have more room, technically, or potentially at least. But for now, the position we're hearing from Russia, from the officials in Russia, and from Russian media, which is very closely calibrated with the Kremlin position, is that they also don't want to concede. So I think we need to see that the battlefield developments proceed and reach a point where one or the other positions becomes dominant, because at this stage there's no room for negotiation. It really is a matter of having a military solution.
And I suppose from the Ukrainian point of view, they don't even want to start to think, if they ever will think, but they don't even want to start to think about what any sort of negotiations might look like until that they've concluded at least this first counteroffensive, which, as you say, hasn't even really properly started or started at all yet. So they know exactly what their relative bargaining power is going to be.
No, absolutely, yeah. The Ukrainian forces are, I mean, there is a sense in Kiev. I would say that the mood in Kiev in general is not rose-tinted glasses. People understand the challenges ahead, but there is a sense that there's really no other option. This invasion has made very clear that Russia's intention is to end Ukrainian statehood. They do not recognize Ukraine as a valid sovereign state, and they do intend to extinguish Ukrainian statehood. So from a Ukrainian point of view, there's really very little option other than to continue as they are. And they've managed to build up quite a significant force over the last few months. Since last November, when the last major movement on the front took place with the liberation of Kherson in the south of Ukraine, large numbers of Ukrainian troops have been trained in neighbouring NATO countries, in the UK as well. They've received a lot of new weapons, a lot of tanks, armoured vehicles, and of course yesterday's confirmation that they are now having these the Storm Shadow cruise missiles. So there is quite a sense of optimism in Ukraine that this counteroffensive could be decisive and could swing things in their way. They're certainly not in a mood to negotiate at this point.
And how much concern is there, though, about continued Western backing? And I'm sure that they will, it's some way off yet, but they will have been listening very closely to what former President Trump had to say earlier in the week about his potential, essentially, withdrawal of support from Ukraine. Like I say, some way off yet until January 2025. But nonetheless, how much concern is there about the prospect of waning Western support?
That's a constant feature. It's been a feature since day one, really, and I think Ukrainians, although the support for Ukraine has been extremely substantial, and it's been decisive in many respects so far, there is a sense that it is not, that no one takes it for granted. And I think the major threat, certainly, as you mentioned, is former President Donald Trump, and what might happen if he were to regain the White House. His comments are hugely alarming from a Ukrainian perspective. His position is very unclear. But having said that, we went through this in 2016 as well, because the war in Ukraine began in 2014. It didn't begin in 2022. It began with the seizure of Crimea, with the invasion of East Ukraine. And when Trump was running for the presidency in 2015-16, he made similarly alarming comments about Russia, favourable statements about Trump. About Putin, excuse me. And there was a lot of alarm then. But when he actually came to the White House, he did not withdraw support. He actually increased support, although, of course, we had the impeachment as well. But if you take the broad view, Trump did not withdraw from Ukraine, did not withdraw American support. So there's a sense, I think, that it could be alarming, but the West is seen to be very committed to this war, and they seem to understand how important it is for the future of global security.
Peter Dickinson, editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert blog, joining us live there from Kyiv. Grateful to him. This